Welcome to Making Waves.
Welcome to Making Waves.
Fresh ideas in freshwater science.
Fresh ideas in freshwater science and why they matter to you.
Making Waves.
Making Waves is brought to you.
Making Waves is brought to you with support from the Society for Freshwater Science.
Hi everyone. Welcome to Making Waves. My name is Susan Washko, and today I want to talk about mussels. What are they, what do they do, and why are they important little organisms? First, we're going to speak with Dr. Michéle Melchior, a freshwater ecologist from New Zealand, who will tell us about the world of mussels. Then we will check in with George Kraynick, Water Quality Manager for Minneapolis Waterworks, who will tell us about how humans can work with mussels to improve water quality. Let's dive in. Welcome to Making Waves, Michéle. Before we get started, would you mind saying a little bit about who you are and your research background?
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me on here to talk about mussels today. So again, I'm Michéle Melchior. I'm a freshwater ecologist, currently based in Hamilton, New Zealand. I received my PhD last year in 2021 from the University of Waikato in New Zealand as well. And I currently work at NIWA, the National Institute of Water and Atmospheric Research, as a postdoctoral research assistant. So a little bit about my PhD research. So overall, it focused on the reproductive ecology of two relatively understudied, threatened and declining New Zealand freshwater mussel species in the order Unionidae. So those two species were Caradella menzesii, the more common but declining species, and Eoclandica, the more threatened species of the two. So those two species are basically found to live together in a number of waterways in the North Island of New Zealand. So freshwater mussels in that order Unionidae, they're really interesting because they have these complex reproductive cycles, which generally involves an obligate parasitic phase on certain host fish species. So that basically means that during their larval phase, they're highly dependent on the abundance and distribution of certain fish species as an important resource base. So often when closely related species coexist together like the ones I studied, what happens is they have to partition resources that allow those species to live together, to coexist together, without outcompeting one another. So basically I used that theory of resource partitioning, and what I did in my thesis is that I characterized and compared a number of different reproductive niche parameters. So for example, I looked at differences in their phenology, their reproductive timing, their different uses in habitat and spatial movement throughout different reproductive phases, and looked at differences in host attraction strategies and infestation mechanisms, and looked at differences in host fish use as well. And all of which we didn't know prior to this research, so that makes it really important for future conservation efforts of those species.
Can you tell us what freshwater mussels are and how they live their lives?
So essentially freshwater mussels, or unionids, they're bivalve mollusks. So bivalves means that they have two hard shells that protect the soft body parts of the animal. And each species is also really unique in terms of their morphology, so they come in all shapes, sizes, and colours that vary from species to species, and of course within species, and depending on the habitats in which they live. Now, freshwater mussels, they're also distributed across the globe, and they're basically found on every continent except Antarctica. There are around 900 species worldwide, and North America has an incredibly high biodiversity, being home to around 300 of those species. Now, where do they live? So mussels, they're often hidden away on the bottoms of waterways. Some species are adapted to small streams, while others prefer rivers and lakes. And unlike their marine counterparts, I guess, instead of using those byssal threads, they actually use a powerful foot muscle to move themselves along the substrate slowly, or bury themselves or hide themselves within muds and sands among gravels and larger rocks, often only leaving exposed the back end of the shell. Now freshwater mussels, they're filter feeders, and although they have that ability to move around, they largely live sedentary lives, so they're mostly stuck in one place, and they spend their time filtering suspended particles from the water column. And so that includes the likes of algae. They filter out detritus, sediments, as well as bacteria and general pollutants. So basically helping to clean up our waterways. Now, one of my favourite parts or my favourite things about freshwater mussels is their life histories. So for one, they are some of the longest living invertebrates in existence, with some species having the ability to survive for as long or over 100 years. And as I said earlier, their reproduction is super unusual, complex, and includes their obligate parasitic phase, which is a little bit out there.
So what's so unusual about their reproduction? How does that work?
So in terms of their reproduction, everything seems pretty normal at first. So the male releases sperm into the water column. The female then inhales that sperm through her inhalant siphon, and the female's eggs are then fertilized within the female's gill brood pouches, so kind of like a kangaroo brood pouch. And those embryos then develop into larvae or glaucidia, which once they have matured can be released into the water column. Now once they're released into the water column, they only have a few days to attach to a compatible host before they die. And because mussels aren't able to actively select hosts, to increase their chances of glaucidia attracting or ultimately infesting specific and compatible host species, most species have evolved a wide range of adaptations and morphological features that allows that to happen. So methods of host infestation strategies actually vary between species. So some mussels, like the New Zealand Emenzii, which is a host fish generalist, it's able to attach onto many species. They actually release their glaucidia individually or on mucus strings, which allows those to passively attach to any fish that they come into contact with. Other species like the New Zealand Eoclandica, it's a host fish specialist, only able to attach or infest one fish species, the common smelt, releases small mucus packages that contain glaucidia. They're called conglutinates, and these float into the water. They mimic prey items like worms, leeches, and juvenile fish, which the host fish is attracted to. It attacks those prey items, those conglutinates, which allows the glaucidia to be released and attach onto the fish. Now, once those glaucidia are attached onto the fish, if the fish is compatible, the glaucidia form cysts on the gills or the fins until they transform into juveniles and drop off wherever the fish has taken them to.
That is so amazing. It seems so counterintuitive that a mussel would make its babies look like fish food so that fish will eat them. But yeah, that's a great way to get them to be able to attach to their host fish's body and get moved to a new location. Okay, so I've heard that 70% of freshwater mussels are at risk of extinction. Why is that?
Yes, so freshwater mussels, they're considered to be one of the most endangered groups of animals in the world. And so around the globe, according to the IUCN risk assessments, it's estimated that I think around 45% of the assessed freshwater mussel species are at risk of extinction or are already extinct. And like you said, in North America alone, 70% of mussel species are at risk of extinction or extinct already. So yes, so why are they in decline? And I guess it comes down to some of the characteristics that I talked about before. So those make them extremely vulnerable to threats. So their filtration abilities makes freshwater mussels really sensitive to water pollution and chemicals such as ammonia, as well as heavy metals that are often found in those streams and rivers and lakes as well. Now, even though they do have that powerful foot that they can use to move around, they generally are just stuck in one place. They anchor themselves into the substrate. So that means that they aren't really able to escape certain threats like other species, such as fish, might be able to. So an increase in siltation, for example, sedimentation from agricultural practices, that can literally bury entire mussel beds. Another example is their dependence on host fish. So especially host fish specialists, they're incredibly vulnerable to declines, particularly when their host fish then aren't around anymore. So reductions through declines of host fish species or fish barriers through dams and culverts, those may lead to declines in mussel species too. Another one is climate change. So, for example, increasing water temperatures, decreasing river flows, drying habitats, they can all affect freshwater mussels in terms of inducing stress on their filtering, burrowing, and reproductive abilities as well. Another one is overharvesting. So historical overharvesting for their pearls, that's had detrimental effects. And also the introduction of non-native invasive species. So like zebra mussels, for example, in huge numbers, they can outcompete native freshwater mussels, basically starving them to death and causing huge declines.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about the fact that they might not be able to move to escape pollution like a fish, or that if their fish partner that moves their offspring around goes away from that ecosystem, what do they do? Wow, they're, facing a lot out there. So what sort of cultural and ecological importance do mussels have? Why should we care about them?
Yes, so in terms of the cultural importance, they are considered to be cultural keystone species. So species that are essentially central to certain cultures and peoples, and species that are so important that they have become embedded in those cultural traditions. So, for example, in New Zealand, freshwater mussels, or kākahi, as we call them in Te Reo Māori, they are considered a taonga for Indigenous people or Māori. So, taonga means treasure or something that's culturally or socially valued. And so, for many years, mussels, they've served as an important food source. So, mahinga kai in Te Reo, and as medicine, and the shells have been used as tools as well. Now, likewise in Australia and America too, Indigenous people have a long, long history of valuing mussels and using mussels as an important natural resource as well. Now, in terms of their value ecologically, freshwater mussels, they're considered an ecological keystone species, so they play a huge role in freshwater ecosystems. And they're also considered ecosystem engineers, so they can modify and improve habitats for themselves and other species as well. So, for example, their filter feeding abilities that I've talked about before, they help to improve the water quality and chemistry and overall benefit the waterways in which they're found. Mussel shells, they can provide habitats or refugia for other organisms. Another one is that their burying abilities, they can help to oxygenate the stream or lake beds, also benefiting other organisms like insects and bacteria too. And because they're able to anchor themselves into the substrate, they can stabilize stream and lake beds, minimizing scouring of floods, for example. Now, beyond those important ecological roles in freshwater systems, freshwater mussels also help us as humans to monitor the health of our waterways. So they're an indicator species. They're hugely important in assessing the health of the ecosystem. So they're basically an alarm bell, an early indicator that something is not right in the waters that they're found in. So when a mussel population is in decline, it's basically an indication that the freshwater system might be in a little bit of trouble.
Nature's alarm bells. I like it. And that's a great segue into our next interview, which is going to dive a little bit deeper into how mussels can tell us if there's something wrong with the water. So thank you so much, Michéle. It's been great learning from you today. You're a wealth of knowledge about mussels, and hopefully we'll talk to you again soon in the future. Okay, let's check in with George Kraynick about how he uses freshwater mussels in his work as a water quality manager.
Hi, George. Welcome to Making Waves. So I've seen some stories in the news about how mussels are involved in water quality monitoring in Minnesota. And I would love to learn more about that from you. But first, will you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is George Kraynick. I'm the water quality manager for the city of Minneapolis. So I'm responsible for drinking water from the river to the tap for our 500,000 customers. And I've been doing water for about 30 years. I actually started out in Pittsburgh, worked there for 15 years, and have been in Minneapolis treating the water here and making sure it's safe since 2011.
Very cool. So we learned in the previous interview that mussels are highly sensitive to water pollution and at risk of endangerment or extinction. So this is true in Minnesota, yes?
Yes, yeah. The DNR has a wonderful website, and you can go on and look and see all the species that are threatened and endangered and are at risk. So it's a really cool resource to look at, and they are in danger. And the ones we use are actually threatened as well, which means they are not on the verge of being extinct yet, but if things don't change in the future, they'll head down that path, which is sad. So we don't want to see that happen.
So what role do mussels play in your work at the water treatment plant?
So back in 2008, the Upper Mississippi River had a group of people made up of the EPA, local utilities, water utilities, and they were concerned about the water quality in the river. And they were looking at ways to monitor it to see how we can see what's in there and protect the drinking water as well as just water for recreational use. And one of the people in the group, the Dr. Joel Allen, he works at EPA out of Cincinnati, had done a lot of work using mussels as what they call bioindicators. Mussels are very sensitive to their environments, kind of like people are. You know, we walk into a room and we smell natural gas. What do? We hold our breath, we walk away. Well, mussels can't do that, but what they can do is when they sense something in their environment, they close up and they'll stay closed until that pollutant or contaminant goes away. And he thought, well, why don't we just measure this and find a way to record that, put it onto a computer, send an email alert, and then here we have this wonderful way to monitor the water 24/7. And the driver behind it is it's really difficult to monitor something 24/7, especially something like water. There's machines that can do it, but they take time to analyze samples for things like petroleum products, chemical products, even things like fertilizer, things like that. You know, you can do it, but it's very labor intensive. It costs a lot of money. And then you still have to wait an hour for the sample results to come back. Where with the mussels, they're there 24/7. They're constantly feeding. And all you have to do is just measure how they open and close their shells and realize that they're going to do it randomly. And then when there's a contaminant, they're all going to close up at the same time. So what he devised is using 12 mussels in a tank and has their wires connected to them. And they measure the gape, which is how far they're open. And he realized that if all 12 mussels close at the same time, there's something in the river that's causing that to happen because they just randomly won't do that because of the way they feed and everything like that. So he developed this algorithm, set it all up on this computer system, and that's what we installed back in 2008 to monitor the water 24/7.
That's really interesting. So the mussels close and that signals to someone at the water treatment plant that there's a problem with the water?
Yeah, so the way it was originally designed is that it would send an email alert to someone. You know, this was 2008, so we weren't as tech savvy then. So it would go to one of our operators, and hopefully they'd be checking their email. And then we had a monitor which would show that the mussels all closed, and they could see that visually as well as get an email alert. But the email part didn't work all that well, so we were kind of stuck with using just the monitor part of it. But it still worked. You know, it still was very functional. The staff could look at it, they could walk by and see it, and if they saw the graph and they saw all the mussels having this flat line, then they knew something happened. Because you can go, like, even if you take like a broom handle and whack it up against the side of their tank, they're not going to close. You know, it really takes something significant to make them close, like draining all the water out or having a contaminant that's in there that they don't like.
That's awesome. Okay, so the mussels close and then the water is tested and treated for whatever might have been the issue. And
Right.
then it's released out into the river. And so then these mussels in the treatment plant are kind of like the first responders or the canary in the coal mine for the mussels that will be in the river that will interact with this water.
Yeah, so that's one way to look at it. The way we looked at it was whatever's causing them to close up is going to be probably difficult for us to treat and something that we don't want in the water. So we looked at it more from a chemical spill, like whether it's a train derailment or an above ground storage tank ruptures and leaks into the river, or somebody illegally dumps something into the river, and it could be something that could be harmful to our customers. And that's kind of our perspective from it. But it can work both ways, obviously. Like if we would see them closing up and not be able to detect anything, we would definitely be notifying the DNR and the Department of Health and saying, hey, there's something in the river. We're not sure what it is. It doesn't seem like it's impacting our water quality, but it's definitely going to be doing something to the other animals and fish that are living in the river itself. So yeah, it's like from our perspective, it's more like that canary in a coal mine, that something got dumped into the river. Nobody told us about it, and it's coming into our plant. And so what our procedures are, whenever the mussels would close, we would immediately have one of our operators go visually look at the river right at the intake where we bring the water in, grab samples, bring them back to the laboratory, make some phone calls, call the duty officer, call myself, call our lab supervisor, have us run some tests. And if need be, if we saw like a sheen on the river, we could shut down our intake because we typically have a 3-day supply of water. And then that'll give us time to analyze it, see what it is. Can we treat it? Can we remove it? And is a risk? And it's just something that a lot of utilities don't have, because it's, like I said, it's very difficult to monitor 24/7 on a source water.
So do you think these mussels, with their instantaneous chemical noticing capacity, can be implemented all across the country or the world?
Yeah, so that's what we're hoping. So when they started in 2008, 2009, Moline had the mussels and we had the mussels. The ones at Moline are no longer there. We're unique where we are. We're right on the river. Our monitoring station's right in our laboratory, so we can check them all the time. We're in Moline, they were at a separate remote location, and the water supply got cut off and their mussels ended up dying, and it was kind of sad. But for us, we monitor them all the time, and we've had them replaced, but we actually got all the original algorithms and all the drawings and everything from Dr. Allen. The EPA would not fund it this time because they have a lot of other projects going on and they just couldn't do it. But he gave all that stuff to us, and we're working with one of the original programmers who developed the algorithm to revamp the whole thing. And we're hoping that we can share this with EPA, and then they can make it available to utilities across the country to use, because it's a very, it doesn't cost all that much. Like in our, we're revamping the whole thing, and it's going to cost about $100,000, which sounds like a lot of money. But to monitor what we're doing on the river, you would need multiple instruments that cost $100,000 each. And you need the staff to run them and everything like that. Well, here you can set this stuff up, and the mussels are self-sufficient. We float, the water's constantly flowing through. And the company that's setting it up, Neptune, they'll monitor the algorithm and everything from afar and make sure everything's fine. And it's actually, we're hoping that other utilities will take us up on it and use the technology as well.
What a cool story. Humans and mussels working together to improve water quality and habitat.
Yeah, and it's awesome. And it's, they work 24/7, and these guys live for a long time. I mean, we have our second set of mussels, but it's not because they passed away or died. It's because they outgrew the sensors, because they can live up to 50 years, if not longer. Nobody really knows. So it's a great pet if you want to have a mussel and it's not threatened or endangered. You can have them in your fish tank and they'll probably outlive you. It's just crazy how long they can live. And they just filter feeders. So you don't need to feed them. You just need to change the sensors every once in a while. And they're just glued onto the back of their shell, and they don't affect them at all. And yeah, it's a really cool way to do it. The other utilities have used like minnows and things like that in a series of tanks where the water comes in one end and comes out the other, and there are like divisions in there. And then if the minnows are all on the outlet side, then there's some contaminant that they're trying to get away from. And then there's cameras that follow the minnows, but they're all fairly complicated and hard to maintain. Where with these, like I said, we've been maintaining them since 2008. The funding dried up in about 2012. And we've been doing it on our own and with very little help from anyone. And it's been working great. So it's a super cool way to do it.
That's really cool to hear. Wow. Thank you so much for joining me today and explaining how all of this works. It's awesome to hear about working with mussels for water quality.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's my pleasure.
You've been listening to the Making Waves podcast.
For more info,
For more info,
please
visit us online.
At the Society for Freshwater Science webpage.
Tune in next time
for another fresh idea in freshwater science.